Hello, American Dreammakers. It is Zena Krogadal. I am your American Dreammaker host this morning, and it is a beautiful morning here in sunny Arizona. Monsoons are here, but the last couple of days we haven't really had a whole lot of monsoons rolling around up here in the Prescott area. Could really use some because it's been hot and humid. I have an incredible guest this morning. I'm really excited because we went to high school together, grew up in Flagstaff together. And back in the day of Flagstaff, it was a whole different environment than it is today. So those of you who have been in Flagstaff recently, as John and I talk, we are going to be talking about the good old days in Flagstaff, reminiscing, but also the current things. But anyways, feel free to hop onto this conversation. It's going to be great. And if you're here, let us know you're here. Don't be shy. Tell us in the comments, ask questions. If you're here, go ahead and share this out. Would love to get the message out because Johnny Dunlap is a fantastic guy doing amazing things and making such a difference with all the people, the community that he is involved with. So before I bring him on, I'm going to play the intro video and then we will get started. Oh, hello again. Yes, it is time to bring on Mr. John Dunlap without any further ado, because I want to get started and talking with John. Hello, how are you?
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. You are down in the Phoenix Valley area. So what is the temperature like right now, John?
It's probably maybe upper 90s, could be close to 100. I haven't exactly looked at it, but just going off from what it is usually when I start my work day and I'm looking, I'm like, wow, it's already 100. But it's been right around 108, 109 recently, where earlier in the month we'd had like some 115, 116, those kind of days, which is interesting. You can feel the difference between like a 116 and a 108. But I heard you say earlier that you guys were hoping on some monsoon storms. And for us, we get the threat of them. They're there. You can see them in the distance every evening. But I think Phoenix has grown so much and it's such an urban sprawl and there's such asphalt and concrete that heats up. And I think those storms, they come towards the valley and they're like, you know what? It's too hot there. Let's stay out here on the outskirts. And because my brother lives way out in Chandler and they'll get storms. And he's like, is it raining over there in Phoenix? I'm like, no, we haven't even got a drop. So we get teased a lot. It's not like Flagstaff where it was thunderstorms every 4 o'clock in the summertime, like a true monsoon. But
yeah, for sure. So John, we grew up together in good old Flagstaff, up in the I'm going to give away our age here, John. Up in the 70s, in through the 80s and up through the 90s. And what an experience. And today I'm really excited to have you on here because it's been so long since you and I have actually connected and seen each other. I think the last time in person was really at the 10-year high school reunion. I don't remember. I know I didn't go to the 20-year. I just went to the 30-year, but I think the 10-year was the last time that we actually connected. Is that correct?
yeah, I was at the 30, but just kind of in and out certain functions. I know they had the event at the Orpheum Theater. I actually had my son with me and went kind of in for a minute and spoke to some people and then left for a minute. So I didn't get to see a lot of people, but I think for us, yeah, it was the 10-year.
Yeah. The 30-year, I know if they combined it because of COVID. And so
Right.
a couple of the classes had missed the high school reunion. And because when we grew up, all the three high schools was pretty much it, the Sonawa, Coconino, and all that. And so I thought it was fun having the three high school together to see everybody. But at the same time, it was a little overwhelming to have it all together every single event, it seemed like. And so because I'm older now, I was getting things mixed up in my mind. Like, did we go to actual Flag High together? Or, it was a little, yeah.
It was cool. I liked it just for the fact that I would say there were people, because they had it for our different class, and which would have been maybe the senior year that was above us and the year below us. So if we were juniors, our seniors, and then the sophomores. So I would say I hung out with a lot of them and knew them. So it was cool to kind of get that whole time frame of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. There's definitely that. I definitely like that too, because like you said, I think we hung out with different grades and all that too. So, well, I want to walk down a memory lane a little bit, John. So you and I grew up in a time of Flagstaff, and I always say, when my family immigrated, we immigrated in 1975, came to Flagstaff, I think, pretty close to 1976. So it was a very different town. It was a much smaller town. I believe the population was closer to 40,000, wasn't as crazy busy as it is now. And there wasn't a whole lot of minorities in the town. It was the diversity just was not there. I think it's more diverse today than it was. But when you and I grew up, we definitely were in the minority as far as, culture and obviously ethnicity and that sort of thing. So I would love to hear, what it was like for you growing up in Flagstaff, because I think our stories, some of it may be similar and then some of it may be different. I think it just might be kind of fun to talk about.
Definitely. So it's interesting to hear your perspective, because in a way, Flagstaff was small, but for me, at times it wasn't, because sometimes I felt I grew up in, quote unquote, the south side of Flagstaff, which was south of the railroad tracks, just north of NAU. And to me, sometimes I felt like we were isolated in that part of town due to different factors, but also, just even if I think I met some people that grew up in East Flagstaff and went to Coconino, and they're around the same age range as me. And we didn't know any of the same people, their life was totally different. There were no parallels. And I was like, wow, Flagstaff was small, but then it had its separations as well. But I would say that once growing up in the South Side and we transitioned to the junior high, where we went to school with everybody that was technically in the west side of Flagstaff, that's when I got to meet people like you, or people who went to Marshall or Sechrist or St. Mary's. You got to coincide with all of that, people from that side, which is technically the west side of Flagstaff. And then you had everybody that went to the east side schools that ended up going to Coconino. And now you would meet a lot of them, but I would say I was a lot closer to the kids that went to the west side schools. But that south side neighborhood that I grew up in, it was very culturally rich. It had a lot of history. And that's part of what I've done as an adult, is try to keep that history alive, try to keep that richness of the South Side, because it was there when I grew up there, but now it's gone due to a lot of different factors. So for me, it was a great place to grow up, even though we were kind of technically segregated in a way, because we were on the other side of the tracks. And for a lot of cities, that's where things are kind of separated. Everybody that lives on the other side of the tracks is totally different from the other side, which may be a little more economical, better, But for us, it was just very rich. It was like our own thing, our own side of town. We had our own experiences, but you're bordered by downtown Flagstaff, and on the other side, you're bordered by NAU. So we had the opportunity to see those two dynamics, and to pretty much have a university in your backyard and as a playground. That was a great thing to have growing up. So we were always on our bikes at NAU, riding around in some of the science buildings and social science buildings, and they'd have to kick us out, but they were cool about it. There was like a healthy dynamic between NAU and the neighborhood.
Wow.
They just allowed us to be there. Now, we couldn't do too much, but I'll tell you a funny story. It was some friends of mine, and we'd go hang out at NAU and just try to see what kind of mischief we could get into. And they had the dining hall at the time. It was more on the north part of NAU's campus. And we just walked into the dining hall like we were students. We were probably around anywhere between 8 and 10 in that age range. So we walk in there. So we're going to stand out. It's probably about 8 of us. And we go up to the ice cream machine and we fill up these ice cream cones and just walk out like it was free. So we get in trouble. They took the ice cream cones away from us. And it was kind of embarrassing in a way, but, you know, just being mischievous kids are like, whatever. And so there were a couple young students, female students, they saw us and they came out and they felt bad for us. And they were like, okay, if you guys break dance for us, we'll go back in and get the ice cream and give it to you because they could get it. And so for us, that was a no-brainer, you know, so we were break dancing for them. So this tells you the time frame of it, you know, totally 80s. But, you know, that was a funny story where we were able to hang out at NAU, get in a little bit of mischief, but it wasn't that big of a deal. Like I said, it coincided really well with a university in a side of town with a lot of kids that would want to be around there and get into trouble.
Yeah, that does sound like a fun community if you had a bunch of kids to ride around with and get into a little bit of trouble. Because I didn't have that in the neighborhood that I was in. But my parents really protected me and sheltered me. Which when I think about this as an adult, it's kind of really interesting because, you know, here we were just coming out from the Vietnam War. My dad had served for the U.S. government. He was a chauffeur for one of the officers, which is why we were fortunate enough to have been evacuated during the fall of Saigon. But here we ended up in a hippie town where most of my friends' parents were hippies protesting the war. And, you know, and I didn't know this growing up as a little kid, you know, that my parents were experiencing that because, you know, as a little kid, your view of things is very different. I just knew I was an American kid. I had American friends and I wanted to American things. And my parents were always like, no, Vietnamese girls don't do that. And Vietnamese girls aren't allowed, you know, and so I was very, very sheltered. And I used to think, gosh, that's so unfair. But when I became a mother myself and I realized, wow, my mom was actually 28, 29 when she came to this country with a new baby, didn't speak the language, was completely in a new culture. She was surrounded by people who protested the war. She didn't know how people really felt about us. You know, she saw how they, you know, were treating some of the veterans and the attitude towards that. And so that I could now, as an adult, I was like, now I understand why she was so protective and why they were so protective. So I was in my little bubble and I didn't get to experience quite that until I got into junior high and high school. Then I had, you know, somewhat of a group of friends. But riding around with bikes and stuff, man, that would have been really nice.
Yeah, I mean, that was like the main mode of transportation, either bike or walk, which is funny now. You know, my son wanted a bike so bad at one birthday, I think like his 8th birthday. It was like the shiny brand new thing. He got the bike. He eventually learned how to ride it. He might have rode it for like 2 months. And the bike has just sat in the garage ever since. Like there's no desire to ride it at all. It's like, video game. Like the bike is like, you don't even see kids riding around with bikes at all anymore. Like we were like a pack of bikes everywhere we went, you know, and we knew how to service the bike, flat tire, chain broke. We were like bike specialist mechanics, you know, but kids nowadays, not at all. But yeah, that South Side neighborhood and that's part of what I miss because it's not there anymore. You know, so a lot of what I try to do and talk about is try to keep those stories alive and keep that history alive, you know, and it was diverse in the sense that it was mainly African-American and Hispanic, that community that I grew up in, from the South Side to the Brandon Holmes area to the La Plaza Vieja area over closer to the west side of Flagstaff. It was a melting pot in a sense. And to go to a elementary school like South Beaver, it was pretty much all minority for the most part, you know. So for us, when we transitioned to junior high, where I would end up meeting you and others, it was a culture shock for us. And a lot of us stuck together, you know, until we were able to venture out and meet friends. And, you know, we had friends of different races, different ethnicities once we got to high school. But that melting pot that I grew up in, it was very diverse as far as minority wise, you know, and I think that's the one thing that I hold on to, the memories of that. And it's funny because you do say that it was a hippie town. And yes, it was. It definitely had the hippie element to it. Interesting thing about diversity, when I was living on the street on the south side, it used to be Agassiz Street, but they changed the name. I think it's Wilson Riles now. They changed a lot of names due to various factors. And so when we were living on Agassiz Street, there were some students from NAU that lived a couple houses down, and they were like totally hippie students at the time. And there was probably like 5 of them that lived in this maybe 2-bedroom. And they were really into the Grateful Dead. And as kids growing up over on the south side, like, what is the Grateful Dead? Like for us, we're thinking it's some cult, like some strange, like, why are they Grateful Dead everything? Like, what is the Grateful Dead, And they were the coolest people, but at first we thought they were strange. Like, who are these Grateful Dead people, And so eventually getting to know them. And that's part of the diversity of the neighborhood. Even though it was a Black and Hispanic community, you would have students who lived off campus, and they were around, and we got to interact with those college students. So that was a great thing about that neighborhood, was the blending in of the college students that lived off campus at times.
Yeah. So John, you just received an award, the Mel Hanna Award.
Yeah.
The first recipient of this award. Can you tell us what this award is and what it means to you?
Okay. So I would say back in 1995, a lot of people who lived in Flagstaff and grew up in the African-American community in Flagstaff that moved away, they wanted to have a yearly reunion, so to speak, of everybody coming back to Flagstaff, because a lot of people move away from Flagstaff, just like we both have moved away. It's a place that you grow up in and you look for more opportunities in bigger cities. Even though sometimes now I wish I would have never moved, especially when it's 115 here. But when you're younger, you tend to want to move away. So these older generations of people, they wanted to put together something called Back to Flagstaff. And it allowed for people who moved away to come back and congregate and gather and have pretty much a reunion. It's like a 3-day reunion. So eventually it became every 2 years. It used to be once a year, and then it was every 2 years. So it's always been a really good thing for us to get back together and see people we haven't seen in years, or see people in my parents' generation or grandparents' generation. And they honor people every year at the ceremony. Now, they didn't have it for a couple years due to COVID. And so I wasn't planning on going this year, actually. And then I was ended up told that you have to come this year, getting an award, which was totally surprising to me, but a little overwhelming at the same time. But I get there, and then they're introducing the award, and I didn't know it was the Mel Hanna Award. Now, Mel Hanna, he was an African-American man that grew up in northern Arizona, and he was the first Black city councilman for the city of Flagstaff. And this was during the mid to late 1970s. And then he ended up transitioning and moving to Phoenix and worked in government here in Phoenix. He was very instrumental in Arizona getting the Martin Luther King holiday. So I knew Mel pretty well. He was a good friend of mine. I would go visit him, and we would talk a lot about community service and government, and just, being somebody who really cares about your community. Community service was very important to Mel. So I didn't know they were giving me the Mel Hanna Award. So when they announced it and said this would be the first ever Mel Hanna Award, I was kind of overwhelmed with a lot of emotion, because this is somebody I knew and somebody I considered a friend, and had these moments with where I considered him as a mentor. So to get that, now he passed away a couple years ago, so to get that award in his honor was very touching, for somebody I considered a friend and had a lot of respect for. And, somebody who kind of ingrained in me the community service and not forgetting where you came from. And, some of the things that I do, I think back to Mel, when I'm speaking and talking about Flagstaff and talking about the South Side and those experiences and keeping that history alive. I know he would be very proud. So it was definitely a special award to get.
Wow. Yeah. What an incredible honor. And, Johnny D, you've always been a really cool cat. Every time I'd see you in the hallways, I'm like, man, he's got that's like one cool guy. Like you just carried the way you carried yourself. And, you know, I think the first time I saw you, I wasn't sure because you were obviously a lot taller than me. I mean, that which isn't hard because I'm pretty short, but but I was like, wow, the way you carried yourself with such confidence, even at a young age. But you have a really big heart. Like as I got to know you, as we'd say, you know, talk, you know, say hello in the hallways and just the little conversations that we would have every so often, even walking to class. I could tell that you had a heart for people and your heart was very, just very kind and generous. And so obviously this award reflects that, that you made a difference in the community that you were in and continue to do so, which is amazing. And I'm absolutely so proud of you. And I'm glad that I'm like, hey, I actually know that fella right there. He was making a difference. I would like to know a little bit more, and because you and I obviously had, you know, different experiences growing up in Flagstaff. We lived in different side of town because I was actually on the other side of the tracks. I was on San Francisco Street, but it was on North San Francisco, so we were about 3 blocks north of the railroad track. And you know, so obviously life was a little different. Like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of kids around my neighborhood. Most of them were kind of older people. There wasn't a ton of kids. So I want to hear more about what it was like. And I love hearing that you were culturally rich and that you had such camaraderie. But I also want to know, as a kid growing up in Flagstaff, did you experience racism or did you notice it? I mean, what was that like growing up as a minority, as an African American?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, San Francisco Street, the street that you grew up on, to me, that was like the main artery for a lot of things because San Francisco extended all the way to the northern part of NAU, went through our South Side neighborhood and went all the way up through downtown. So I'm assuming you lived a little bit north of downtown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot that transpires just in that road itself because you start at NAU, you go through the South Side. And then at that time when I grew up there was a string of bars that was in our neighborhood. There was probably 6, 7 nightclubs and bars that were in our neighborhood, you know. So South San Francisco Street was known for having all the bars. Mm-hmm. So that was there, you know, and I remember walking to school most days. We had to go through South San Francisco and you had to cut through the bars. So as kids, we had to deal with that environment of bars and people drinking and dealing with, you know, drunk people on the way to school and broken glass and broken bottles. So that was the dynamic of the area. And as you cross the tracks and you go downtown, you know, it starts to change. You have the downtown, it's more touristy. And then you get into more of the neighborhoods that were closer to Flag High. So one time, it was a Saturday, I would say. Now, mind you, we walked to school pretty much every day, Monday through Friday. And it was just, you know, non-eventful besides little mischievous stuff that we did as teenagers or kids. But this was one particular Saturday. I want to say we were going to some kind of event somewhere. I think it was at Flag Junior High. There was something going on there. Me and my friend Chris, we were walking and we got pulled over by the Flagstaff Police Department. We're just walking, you know, not doing anything, not causing any trouble at all. You know, we're just walking to go to this event, just like any normal day we would walk to school. So the officer kind of circles around and he comes back towards us and then he makes us stop and he gets out of the car. And he, for no reason, questioned us. He thought we were gang members. He questioned the attire that we had on. So really just an intimidating situation, you know, to go through. And like, look, we go to school here Monday through Friday. We're students at Flag High. Like, why are you harassing us? And he wanted to know our names and how many gang members were in this certain gang that we were in. So, you know, pretty much a harassing conversation that leaves a sour taste in your mouth as a teenager. You know, it's like we were just harassed for nothing, you know, and it's a scary incident as well. You know, you never know what can happen in those situations. So that was one moment that really stands out for me. Now, a place like Flagstaff is quote unquote very liberal. Mm-hmm. So for me, at times, I felt like maybe racism would be subtle. It would be something that you didn't see face to face, but you could notice it behind the scenes in certain actions or certain things that were done or certain behaviors. There was never like this blatant in your face that was prevalent like that. But I always could feel like there may be something hidden, or if something didn't happen, or I didn't get something, or I was like, wow, why did they do us like that? You know, no one just came out and said any kind of slurs. Not to say that it never happened. There would be stuff like that, but just in general, the total climate, it always seems like it was behind the scenes in some kind of way. And I think that's what you get with a lot of America in certain more progressive liberal areas, because you think racism, you think the South, or you think maybe bigger cities back east that are more heavily segregated. But I think on the West or West Coast, sometimes it's very subtle in certain things that you see. And it always makes you question, you know, they were smiling in my face, but what did they say behind my back? So it was that kind of thought that I would get from Flagstaff. How did you feel about it? Did you feel certain things like that growing up?
I think it was probably, like you said, pretty, I think it just wasn't in your face. So I don't think I noticed it much, to be honest, growing up. Now, you know, did some people make comments once in a while? Yes. But I think, you know, I personally didn't experience a lot of that living in Flagstaff. What was really interesting, though, as you were saying this, I did spend a year in Oklahoma because Mike, my high school sweetheart that I'm was married to for a short time, he wanted to go to Oklahoma. So we were in the small town McAllister, which was about 90 miles south of Tulsa. And that was my first experience of really seeing racism, like so blatant racism. Like they were like stuck in times that I was just mortified, because I remember I was working at a dental office and the office manager had made a comment because one of our friends that lived in Oklahoma was African American and great guy, but he was one of the reasons why Mike wanted to be out there. So she had met him. Well, I didn't know this, but she said that was the first time she'd ever met a Black man, and he was so great to talk to and so intelligent, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, of course, like, why would you think anything different? Like, I'm like, you know, so to me, I was like, huh? And then she would make comments to somebody like, oh, well, you know, this is where I grew up and you don't drive around with a Black man in your car. You don't do that. And I remember her asking me one morning, hey, what did you do last night? And I said, oh, I hung out at the park with the dog. And she goes, where at? And I told her where. And she goes, that's the Black side of town. I said, okay. And she says, well, you're not supposed to be there. I said, well, nobody seemed to care. Like, what do you mean I'm not supposed to be there? Like, nobody seemed to care. There was no signs, don't be here. You know what I mean? I'm thinking, and I looked at her, I said, do you realize that this is 1997 and segregation is now over? Like, I don't understand what you're talking about, you know? And
that's interesting you say that, because I think back to Flagstaff and something similar to that. So once we transitioned into junior high and we started going to school with more kids from different schools, you start interacting with them and they ask you, you know, where are you from or where you grew up? And we tell them we grew up on the south side of Flagstaff. And there were some students who were like, I've never been over there, or my parents told me not to go over there. So it's interesting how beliefs are kind of manifested kind of within the home, or you get them through your parents. And I'm like, what? Like, we go all over Flagstaff. Like, why would you not come through there? And it was just, you know, certain stereotypes. I think that they thought like it was dangerous over there, or this is going on over there. And I'm like, what? Like, you would never go through there? It's like, no, we never drove over there. We never hung out in the neighborhoods or anything like that, which for us was kind of silly, but you know, it was a similar experience, you know. But to me, once you create friendships with people and you create bonds and you break down barriers and you have actual conversations and you befriend people, all those misconceived prejudgments go out of the window. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you an interesting story that happened when I was working here in Phoenix and I was doing some respite hours for my master's program. I had to volunteer and do weekly hours, and I ended up getting picked by this family. I want to say might have been like a Mormon family, and they were older. They were probably in their late 60s at the time. And they had two adult grown sons, but I don't remember the name of the disability they had, but it was where they were kind of stuck at a certain childhood age, probably like around the age of 10, even though they were grown. I forget what the disability was, but they were kind of stuck in that childhood stage. And so my job was to go spend time with them and do recreational things. We go bowling, we get food, we go to the movies. So these were the hours that I had to do. But the very first time that I met the family, I went over to their house, and my hair was really long. It's long now, but it was longer then. And it was pretty neatly braided. So kind of a conservative look that I might do on job interviews, or if I have to go to work and it has to be very neat. So they saw me that way in the beginning. And I'm sure they probably had some preconceived notions at the time, but they didn't say anything. But the next day when I had to go pick them up, my hair was totally undone. So it was this big, wild afro that was long. And I remember the father, he saw me get out of the car and he did like a triple take. So I don't know what he thought, like, who's this guy coming to get my sons? Like, where are they going? So I could tell, you could sense there was some apprehensiveness, And the funny thing is, like, I remember him coming up to me and he was like, the boys they love music. They're kind of conservative in what they listen to. They like the oldies, cool FM, whatever station it was. They like that kind of music. They're kind of not sensitive to the explicit lyrics or the crazy, wild hip hop. And I was laughing to myself, but I was like, I love the same kind of music they like. I rock to the oldies as well, So it was no thing to crank it up with them and have a good time. So as time went on, as they got to know me and we got to build relationships, and I got to know his parents, and they saw how I was hanging out with their boys, and we would have a good time. It just tore down so many walls. And by the end of my hours, they were baking me cookies, inviting me to their functions, just super nice. I think they made like a blanket. So it just made me think of how there's so many apprehensive moments with people who don't know each other. And I think that's one thing that we need to get back to, is just having genuine moments of interaction, face to face, voice to voice, hearing people out, hearing different sides of the coin. And that allows you to have a different respect and be open with it. You can't go into it with your wall up, like, I don't care what they say, or I don't care about their experiences. Just be open-minded. And then you'll find out that we have a lot more in common than we don't.
Right. And you're right, to listen with understanding. Hi, Debbie. Good to see you. Thanks for being here and joining us. Debbie's a great friend. She lives, I think she's in Ohio still. So anyway, she's not in Arizona, but Debbie's a great gal. Yeah, I agree, John. When we listen to understand, and not the, hey, I already know that, you and I aren't going to have anything in common, so I'm going to put the walls up. You lose out. You really lose out. Oh, yes, Debbie, for sure. Have genuine moments and be open-minded, for sure. And you can learn from so many people. And so the office manager, which was really cool, like you said, until she was exposed, she didn't know. Well, by about 6 months in, she ended up having to, one of the patients needed a ride home. His mom couldn't come get him or whatever. And it was a young Black man. And she said, you know what, I'll go ahead and drop you off. And so she took him home, and one of the assistants like, oh my gosh, you just had a Black man in your car. Do you realize what just happened? And she goes, he's such a nice young man. And what was I supposed to do? He didn't have a ride home, and I could take him. So I don't want the poor kid walking. And I'm like, good for you that she finally started to realize, people, it's just people, not what you think or any of that. You're going to be in Arizona tomorrow. What? That's cool. Well, it's hot out here, Debbie. So prepare yourself. Prepare yourself. So it is. And what I did experience more than anything, as an adult, I experienced people didn't necessarily have an issue with me personally, but they didn't like the interracial relationship. for a time there when they would see myself and my husband. There, not a lot, but just a few. If I had experienced anything, it was more that, that they didn't like the interracial, the mixing, which is on both sides because, growing up Vietnamese and being around the Asian community, the Asians feel just as strongly about interracial relationships as anyone else. Packing clothes, yes, hot. And so that was interesting, for sure, growing up. And my children growing up in Prescott here, which was, I think in some ways similar to Flagstaff, although Prescott is probably a little more conservative compared to Flagstaff being liberal, but it still is a pretty, what you would say, a friendly community overall. But my kids did tell me that they didn't always feel like they belonged, like they weren't really belonging with Asians, but they also weren't really belonging with the white kids. And many of the kids thought they were Mexican anyway, that sort of thing. So it's always interesting to kind of hear. But
yeah, that's interesting too about Prescott, because my first interactions with Prescott was through sports. So the interesting thing about sports is playing sports for Flag High. We had very diverse sports teams. So we would go certain places in northern Arizona where it wasn't as diverse, whether we were in places like Cottonwood or Snowflake or even Prescott, and you could tell the difference in going to some of those places. Obviously, it's sports and it's competitive, but sometimes the competitive nature in sports can lead to hostile environments where it blurs the line between being a more diverse, racially diverse team and not. And in the heat of moment, you could hear slurs and different things like that. Now, there was an incident before my time where there was an athlete from Flag High named James Dugan who got into it with somebody in Prescott behind some racial slurs. And there was a lot of tension. He was like the Arizona Player of the Year from Flagstaff, and they had a big incident in Prescott. And I think he ended up getting suspended and couldn't play anymore. So it was a very big controversial incident. So we knew about that stuff going into Prescott. So there were a lot of times we'd go to certain smaller towns in northern Arizona with the thought in mind that there could be something racial that could happen. Now we're going to always play hard and be respectful and not start anything. But there was always that thought in the back of your head, like, wow, we're in this town. Something can happen. I know one time we had an incident in Kingman, just we won, and they weren't too happy about it. And there were some racial slurs thrown around, and it just was interesting. So sometimes going back to Flagstaff was like, okay, we're back home. We're back in our kind of melting pot, so to speak, and just thought like, hey, the world is quite different from where we grew up in. But then we go back to our little South Side neighborhood, and it's secluded in a way, and it's different from a lot of areas in Flagstaff. But one of the things that I was very grateful for after I graduated and started going to NAU, I was able to get a job in my neighborhood at the Cogdale Recreation Center. And working at that recreation center allowed us to do a lot of community work. And we were able to use our budget from the city to do a lot of community things for the kids, for the neighborhood. It was very rewarding to do that. So I think a lot of what I do started from that basis, working in the community, and, how thankful I was to be able to grow up and then give back to that neighborhood. So that was very important to me, but also seeing the changes in our neighborhood from that time to go from what it was growing up through the 80s and being a young person in the 90s and my 20s, and seeing the neighborhood change and evolve to what it's became now. That part, sometimes there's a lot of hurt with that because I've seen it with my own eyes evolve. So you have this rich cultural neighborhood that we grow up in, but due to gentrification and other factors, it's not there anymore. So now when I go back and visit, it's almost like a ghost town for my neighborhood. Yes, Flagstaff is much bigger, much more vibrant, more traffic, more things, more populated than we grew up and we saw. But to lose what I had, that part is hard to take, to see those changes and to see the neighborhood dwindling down to where I could see a whole street of families that I knew there might be one or two left. And I'll see a house, I'll see the house that I grew up in. It's no longer there, but there's a $1 million house that's on that lot there. It's like, wow, you know, who would have ever thought? Or to see all these businesses on the South Side. I saw like Dutch Brothers and restaurants in different places, you know, and we would have loved to have had that stuff when I was growing up there, because we could have probably walked a couple blocks and had a summer job. But there was none of that there when I was growing up there, you know. So to me, there's a lot that I see now that, you know, I don't feel good about, because I would love to be able to go back and be like, wow, my neighborhood has all this growth. We have all these things there. The community's still intact. But sometimes I go there and it's almost like you're a visitor. I'm like, these streets are familiar, you know, some things are still familiar, but where are the people? And to me, it's the people that make the community. It's the fabric of the community. It's those people, you know, and until 2000, you could always trace back to someone's grandparents or great grandparents or your parents. There were generations of people in that neighborhood, and now it's totally cut off. Like my people my son's age don't live there. You can't afford to live in that neighborhood now, which is the sad part. So to be able to say, hey, you know, I would want to live here and raise my son here, you know, it's totally priced out and expensive due to a lot of the different factors that have contributed to a lot of people that I grew up with. They don't live there anymore, you know, kind of the exodus of people moving from Flagstaff, you know, and that part is what really hurts, you know, to see something so vibrant and so rich that I can speak on for hours. It's not there anymore. There's murals around that tell you the history, but someone could go to the neighborhood and be like, okay, I see these murals, but where's the proof of this? Where's the community that this mural was painted? I don't see any traces of it.
Do you think that part of that, you know, because I feel like it's not just Flagstaff that experiences that. I feel like even as a nation, we are losing some of the history. And it's almost like there's some people who don't want that to be a part of history. And I'm not quite sure how to put my finger on it, but do you feel like that, you know, do you sense that, I guess, going back and you're seeing, okay, all this stuff is gone. Why are we getting rid of the historical aspects of Flagstaff? Because this is part of Flagstaff. This is part of what made Flagstaff.
Right. It's the people, it's the community. And when you don't have the community, there's no more history to be made. So to me, sometimes it seems like they try to benefit off the history. They have these murals, they have these events, they'll do certain things in the community, and they'll use the history as the platform. But it's kind of sad to do something and use our history, but my relatives can't live there anymore. They can't afford to live in this same. So you're going to throw this event in this neighborhood, but we can't afford to live there. It's more affordable to get 5, 6 college students in this 2-3 bedroom house than you could have a middle class, lower middle class family. They've been priced out of that community. So to me, sometimes it's almost like the dollar is more important than the people. It's more important than the history. You know, hey, if we can change this building here and make it into these high-rise duplexes, which you do see in Flagstaff now. You see that they've even taken advantage of the views. You ride through Flagstaff, you see these big old huge buildings that block the views that were once there. And so for me, it's like, okay, so it's almost profit over people in a way. And it's profit over the people who made up the fabric of the community. You know, so you're willing to use this history and be like, oh, historical Southside Flagstaff, historical area, put up a mural. Let's celebrate the history. But what about right now? Yeah. So it's funny. I did a speech for the Tempe Center of the Arts, and they were talking about tourism and vacations. So they wanted me to speak on vacations, but they wanted me to speak about Flagstaff and vacation. And so to me, the premise of my speech was a lot of people visit Flagstaff like it's hectic to get up from Phoenix to Flagstaff on a holiday weekend. It took me like 6 hours one time to get up on a 4th of July weekend. So everybody's up there now trying to escape the heat. So they're going up there, they're staying in Airbnbs, and a lot of these Airbnbs or places they may stay were probably homes that were owned by some of the pioneering minority Black community residents of Flagstaff. They may have owned that at one time. And so somebody may move up and be like, wow, this is a cool Airbnb I'm staying in. We're close to NAU, we're close to downtown, but they have no clue of the history of where they're staying in that Airbnb in. So for me to give that speech at Tempe Center of the Arts, a lot of people were just surprised to know that. And they came up to me after the speech like, wow, we didn't even know. We go to Flagstaff every summer, or we go up in the winter and we go skiing. We didn't know that any of this existed. And so for them, they were like, wow, thanks for enlightening us. Now when we go, we'll have a better understanding of the area that we may be in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as you were saying that too, as we were talking about, racism and all that, I really believe that most people in their hearts aren't full of hate. I think a lot of people are insensitive and just don't know. They just have not been exposed, kind of like you said. They just don't know. They've only been told, and they didn't explore outside of that. But there are some people, I have met a few in my life that definitely have a true hatred. And that comes in from all skin colors, like that hate of another race. Thankfully, it's, I haven't experienced that to a huge degree. Because like I said, I think most people are just insensitive. They'll say things that are like, yeah, you probably shouldn't say that. That's kind of really insensitive. I don't think that the intent was to be racist. They just, whatever, said it because they didn't know. But I'm curious, what made you decide to move from Flagstaff? Because it sounds like, you had such a great experience. You had a great community, and then you decided to venture out. What was that? I guess what helped you decide to say, I'm out of here?
What led to that? I think a couple different factors. I think I really enjoyed what I was doing. I enjoyed the work in the City of Flag Parks and Rec. I enjoyed the community work that was there. I was very fulfilled to be able to work somewhere where I could give back to the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I was definitely starting to see a lot of the changes at the time. So it was a very critical time to move away, where a lot of the gentrification was starting to take place. Sometimes I feel like if we were a little bit more united in that, maybe some of that could have been offset in a way. To leave at that time, it was definitely hard to do. I think growing up in a smaller place, you always think about other opportunities that you can have in a bigger city. I would think, okay, so what if I lived here my whole life and had some regret that I never moved away? But actually, I tried to move back a couple times, actually. And one of them was to get back a position that I had with the City of Flag Parks and Rec. The recreation leader that was my supervisor, he ended up passing away right after I moved. And everybody was like, hey, you got to come back. This is your job. This is your position. You got to come back. And I attempted to come back, and for whatever reason, it did not work out that way. And then back in 2018, they had a community liaison position open between NAU and the City of Flagstaff. And there was, I don't know, maybe 200 people that applied for this position. And it came down to me and another lady that worked for NAU. So it was us two. And we ended up having to do a live interview with, I think all the news outlets were there. We did it at the Murdoch Center on the South Side, which was 2 minutes from where I grew up. I felt really good about the interview. I really felt that I would have done a good job being a liaison. I worked for City of Flagstaff, so I already had that going for me. I attended NAU, so I had that going. So I had the best of both worlds. And I really felt like could make a difference. They wanted somebody to be able to be a go-between between the residents who were still living on the South Side, who were older, and would have conflict between college students and the rowdiness and the parties and things like that. You know, somebody who could bridge that gap so both sides could be heard. And I didn't get it. I was shocked, like totally shocked that I didn't get it, you know. But to me, it was maybe kind of a sign that, hey, you know, some things are meant to be and some things are not, you know. So I attempted to go back up there twice, but it didn't happen. But recently, I've been able to do a lot more advocacy, like doing things like this and be able to speak to Flagstaff. So to me, it's very important that the history of my generation is documented and recorded, because I think they use a lot of the prior history, the pioneering history, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. But there was so much that went on in the 80s and the 90s that was that bridge right before a lot of the change that I saw, a lot of the gentrification. There was so much that went on, you know, in that generation of my friends that grew up there in the 80s and 90s. We witnessed a lot. There was a lot that went on in that neighborhood. There was a lot of that neighborhood went downhill to a lot of different factors. You know, there was a lot of drugs in that community. There was a lot of things in that community that brought it down, that kind of made it ripe for the gentrification. You know, if this neighborhood goes down and the quality goes down, it's easy for the property to be cheap. It's easy for the developers to go in there. It's easy for the elderly people who may want to retire in Phoenix or California or somewhere else to easily sell their property for a lower price, not knowing if they held out, they could have got a lot more for it. So there was a lot of factors that my generation got to see. And I think that history is very important. And I think it'll be important as we move into the future to document, hey, it's not just people that grew up in the 50s, lived there in the 60s and 70s. There's that generation from the 80s and 90s that went through a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to put your Instagram handle up. You guys, if you want to get a hold of John Dunlap, at Mnemonic25. Mnemonic25. Why did you pick that as your handle of that? There's got to be a story behind this one.
There is a story behind it. There was this obscure 1980s movie called Johnny Mnemonic. And I think Keanu Reeves was, I think it was like a disaster, like a bad movie. I think the ratings were totally terrible. And I just always remembered. So earlier, I think you might have said Johnny at a time. So it's interesting, in Flagstaff, growing up in elementary school, there were two Johns in the elementary school at South Beaver. And so the teachers would be like, okay, one needs to be John and one needs to be Johnny. So for me, it was Johnny. So a lot of people from Flagstaff, they'll say Johnny, but my name is John. And so when I moved away from Flagstaff, this is like a little funny story. So I'm always introducing myself as John. I'll never say Johnny at all. So it almost separates the two different sides of the coin. So if I hear Johnny, I'm like, they must be from Flagstaff. So it allows the people from Flagstaff to have that special name. And then if I hear John, it's like, okay, somebody I just met or somebody, you know, that's here. And then there's also, I was a teacher. I taught at Chandler High School after I left Flagstaff. I taught high school. And so the students will say Mr. Dunlap. So if I hear Mr. Dunlap, it's a student, a former student. If it's John, it's somebody I just met. If it's Johnny, it's somebody from Flag. And it's funny because somebody will hear, there was somebody that knew somebody from Flag, and they were like, hey, do you know John from Flag? They're like, who? So they mentioned all these Johns. They were like, Johnny? They was like, yeah. So they came back and they were like, hey, Johnny. And I was like, I looked at them like, where'd you hear that from? Or it almost ignored them until they said John, and then I would respond. So this is a little funny thing with the name.
It is, and it's very, you know, yes, I knew you as Johnny, and I always thought of you as Johnny D. It's Johnny D, you know. And same thing for me, you know, growing up, I was Na, and so switching to Zena, it absolutely differentiates, you know, at what point in time did you meet me and how did you get to know me? So those that knew me from Flagstaff and even into my adult, and then yeah, so it's actually kind of fun. And then of course, telemarketers, you know, it's always good to, you know, you can really, I guess, decipher if you want to take this call or not as to how, if they even know how to pronounce my name.
Exactly.
Exactly. But yeah, so that's a lot of fun. And I like that, mnemonic 25, at mnemonic 25. So be sure to get a hold of John Dunlap. He is a great guy, as you can see. And if you need him at any of your speaking events, obviously he's a speaker and he's very articulate. And so if you would like to schedule him, get a hold of him. He's a very friendly guy, as you can see. Now, this time, as we wrap up, I know I was telling you before we went on that I feel like this time goes by very quickly when we're in a good conversation, and it's been a great, because there's so much more we could talk about.
Yeah.
And you've got how many kids, John?
2. I have two boys.
How old are they?
They're 12 and 13.
Oh boy.
They're right behind each other. So they're preteen stage. So it's definitely, I wouldn't say a challenge, but it's interesting. You go through these different phases, and my oldest son, he's definitely in the question asking phase of life. He's always curious and wants to know. And it's funny because he's very into history, but he's silly. He's jokey, comedic, he has a good personality. One day he was like, Dad, did it rain like this in the 80s? We're having like a monsoon storm down here, which is funny because we haven't had a lot of rain this monsoon season. He's like, Dad, did it rain like this in the 80s? I'm looking at him like, really? It's like, what did it smell like in the 90s? He'll ask silly questions like that. And my youngest son, he's very techie. He can take apart computers and put them back together again. So he's definitely into that stage, super smart. So 2 boys, then the time goes by so fast, like you just mentioned, this interview flew by, but their lives fly by, and that's something that I try to slow down as much as I can, because there's a part of you that, you want things to move forward, but it's like when you're kids, I need that to slow down, 5 more years and my son will be 18, I'm not ready for that yet. So I'm trying to slow that down. But one thing that was interesting that I said in the speech that I gave, we were talking about the gentrification, and my son, he was there at the time, and he was sitting in the audience, and I said, you can't gentrify the memories, you can't gentrify the experiences. Me being able to pass these stories down to my son or take him to Flagstaff to see the places I grew up in, you can't gentrify experiences, you can't gentrify friendships and relationships and the bonds that I have with the people from that neighborhood that mean so much to me. That can't be gentrified, that can't be taken away. So the more that I can speak and advocate and promote the history of where I grew up and allow people to know about this special place and that special time, that can't be changed, gentrified, or taken away from me.
That's so good. So good. Well, I would say, even though years have passed so fast, you haven't aged much at all. Maybe a year or 2, that's about it.
It's there. Some gray sprinkled in. It doesn't show up as closely on camera that if you came up in person, you'd see it sprinkled in through there. So
I don't know how you feel, but sometimes when I scroll through Facebook and I see people on there, and they're not necessarily people that we've gone to school with or anything, but I scroll through and I'm like, gosh, that person looks like they really aged a lot. And then it turns out they're the same age, as myself. And I'm thinking, how's that possible? Do I look that old too? You start to think, oh my gosh, we're the same age. What the heck happened?
It's funny that you said that. I remember being in high school, and seeing maybe seniors that were seniors when maybe we were a sophomore and they've graduated. And so I'm still in high school, and for whatever the circumstances, they were working a job as an adult, and they had adult lives and adult responsibilities. Like, I remember them being a senior when I was a sophomore. It just seemed like their life was so much older than mine. A couple of them had kids, and I would sit there and look and like, wow, you got to be maybe 21 at the oldest, but it just seemed like life was just so much more intense and they aged so much more. So it's like, I waited longer to have kids too. So,
well, which is great. I mean, we all, obviously I was younger in my mid-20s when I started. So my kids are grown now, that's the weird part, is that my daughter is 25. She'll be 26 in October. And my son is 24, the youngest. And it's strange to think that I have young adults that age. And I think there's obviously, I guess, advantages and disadvantages to having them younger versus older. But
Yeah.
either way, I think it's great. Whenever you get to be a parent, it's a gift. You obviously have a little more wisdom to give your kids than I did when I was in my mid-20s. I still try to figure things out. So
There's a lot of figuring out too as an older parent. You know, sometimes I'm like, I would have did this a lot differently when I was younger, or I might have had more energy to do certain things when I was younger, where now I'm just like, you know, go play, let me rest. It's my weekend, you know. But yeah, it's there's pros and cons to it, you know.
yeah.
Have your kids been back to Flagstaff a lot? Do you take them up there a lot?
You know, not a lot. We have been up there, and they've seen, you know, where I used to live and all that. And so, but not a lot, because there's not a lot for us to go back to. My family moved to Las Vegas in '95, and most of the people I know aren't in Flagstaff anymore. I mean, so there's not a lot of reason to make that trip. And like you said, traffic's a beast, you know, going up and down there, that sometimes you're like, do I want to do that or not? But it's beautiful. And you mentioned about how I wish we would have had Dutch Bros and all those things when we were growing up. Gosh, there's so many things that I look at Flagstaff. I'm like, why wasn't that there when we were, you know, it would have been not as boring. We would have had so much more to do. Even a theater, the Harkins Theater. Wow, that would have been really nice, you know, because we had Green Tree. And
do you know, I was thinking the other day, there was Orpheum, Green Tree, University Theater, Flag East, and the Mall. So there were 5 theaters spread out through Flagstaff that we had growing up. And now there's just one big, huge Harkins. It was like 20 some theaters in it. So they got rid of all this. I think the Orpheum's still there, but there's more concerts that.
Right. It's not
music
really
concert, not movies. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it is, it's fun to walk around downtown, but it is so different than when you and I grew up. I mean, but there are still some iconic places in there, like Joe's Place. I mean, that's been there forever. And, you know.
Yeah, there's definitely still some landmark things that are there. And I mean, if anything, you know, to get up there, the nice weather, especially in the summertime or wintertime, if you love winter and skiing and things of that nature. I tell people all the time, it's different when you have to grow up in snow and cold, and you have to shovel, and you have to have an ice scraper on your car, and you have to do all of those things, and it's more of a chore. It's different if you're up there recreating, you know, and having fun in snow. It's a lot different than having to work in it. You know, it's kind of like here, if you have to get out and work in 110 degrees and drive and get in the car and wait for the AC to cool the car down and do all of that, it's a pain. But if I could chill by a pool and sip drinks and dive in the pool and recreate, I wouldn't mind the heat so much. So there's the parallels between Flagstaff cold and Phoenix heat. But I don't know if Flagstaff gets as cold as it did. I know they had some cold days, but I don't know if they have that cold like we probably experienced.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I do. It's funny because I remember going to college, right? And they never canceled college classes.
Oh no, NAU, like I don't know what would cause NAU to cancel. I remember walking through some torrential storms and snowstorms just to get to class. Like they wouldn't cancel for anything, but I heard they canceled recently. Which I was shocked, but
yeah. And I'm saying down here in Prescott, like if there's an inch on the ground, they'll cancel college. I'm like, what the heck? Everybody's getting so soft. What do you mean you're canceling?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a lot to consider of what could happen. I guess in our days, there was just like, hey,
I think
they can get here, they need to get here. But now it's like, what could happen if this happened? And we don't want this to happen.
Yeah, all the liability stuff. That's what it is. All those lawsuits that came in. And so now we think things differently. But again, that's where we get aged. I mean, so people may not know how old we really are when they meet us. But when we open our mouths and start talking, John, that's when they realize, oh, this is an old person. Because
yeah.
You know, our experiences are so different, you know what I mean, than the younger generation. It's like, I may look like I can hang with a 30-year-old sometimes, but as soon as I open my mouth, you'll know real quick that I'm not a 30-year-old.
Yeah, my son was asking me about pagers the other day and stuff like that. And it's like, you're old. You had to have pagers. You had to have the press button telephones and different things.
we didn't have cell phones to text each other. Look, I would tell the kids that, back in the day, we had to make a plan to call our friends. And then that may or may not have happened because your mother might have been on the phone line, or your sibling might be on the phone line at the time you scheduled the call. So you could have pretty much gone all night and you didn't get to get on the phone and call your friend and blew them off. These days, everybody's so like, hey, they didn't respond. They left me on red and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, wow, they want this instant, where are you? Why aren't you picking up? Why aren't you answering me?
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny quick story. So speaking of technology and how times have changed, there'd be certain times in Flag High that we ditch an hour or whatever, we would go downtown and eat somewhere and come back. Like you could do that within an hour and eat and come back. So I knew what time the automated system would call the house. It was always right around 7:30. So I'd make sure I've hung around the phone. I'd pick up the phone. And I'm pretending that I'm talking to one of my friends. Like, oh, really? That happened today? Oh, did you do the assignment? I'm sitting there having this fake conversation, but in the background, it's like your son or daughter has missed one or more periods today at school. Now that doesn't exist. Or even I knew when the progress reports were going to come. So if I had like a low grade or something, you would intercept the mail and you would keep it. You could even intercept your report card. Now, my dad knew there were going to be quarterly report cards, so I couldn't hide it for too long.
Yeah.
He'd be like, hey, isn't that report card? Shouldn't have been out by now. I was like, I got to go in here and get it and give it to him. But nowadays, it's instant. You get text messages on your phone. You get emails sent to your phone. So kids can't do any of that anymore.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but because Flagstaff was so small back then, I felt like everybody knew my parents. And so when I did ditch, or if my sister ditched, if we went downtown, my parents would know about it pretty much that day. So it was like, and it was like, that was the reason why I left Flagstaff, is because I went to the mall. My parents had moved to Vegas, and my mom said, hey, I heard you were at the mall today. And I'm thinking,
Oh, wow.
you don't even live in the same town. How did you know? And I'm like, I got to move to a place where nobody knows my parents.
And see, my dad, he worked in Sedona, so which was a great thing, So Sedona's 25 minutes away from Flag. So I was like, my dad's in Sedona. So if I did some kind of ditching, but you're right. Somebody could have said, hey, we saw your son downtown. I know we should have been in school. But one thing about the mall, I know the mall was like a big thing for us growing up. Like now malls are closing and everybody shops online. There was one day I told my dad, I said, hey, can you take me out to the mall? And these are kind of how hardcore our parents was. My dad was like, yeah, I got to go out that way. I'll take you there, but you need to find a ride back. So just imagine that. Now I was probably in 10th grade. So I wasn't a small child. Right. And so I'm like, cool. And this is like how you said, there's always somebody, at the mall. So I'm thinking like, okay, I'll hang out at the mall. Just get me there. And I'll see somebody that I know that'll be able to give me a ride back home. So I'm at the mall just hanging out, and it was like a Saturday. So the mall was getting ready to close. It was getting dark. And I'm like, I can't believe this. I don't know one single person out here at the mall today. If it had been any other day, you just saw everybody. So then I'm like, oh, wow, I need to get back home. So this is way out in East Flagstaff, trying to walk from there back to the south side was definitely going to be a challenge. So I'm like, okay, I need to start walking. So I'm walking down the main freeway there. But then as a kid, you're the type that's like, I don't want someone to see me walking. So you'd be kind of embarrassed. So I'm taking these like side streets, right? And trying to cut through these different areas and neighborhoods. It was completely pitch dark, right? And I don't even think I got halfway of the trip back home. And luckily I saw one of my friend's dads driving. I flagged him down. He's like, what are you doing way out here? I was like, man, I'm stranded. Can you take me home? And he took me home. But there's no cell phones. There's none of that in those days to make that call. Luckily I had like some change on me. I went to a payphone, but nobody was at home. I couldn't call somebody's cell phone. So it's just interesting to know how times change and the conveniences we have of cell phones now. For sure.
Well, John, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and joining American Dream Makers. I mean, American Dream Makers, I believe that the American dream belongs to all of us. And not only can you achieve it, but you can go beyond. John, you absolutely have achieved the American dream, and you're helping others, and you're helping to preserve the American dream history. And so just continue that great work, because you're right, it is so needed, because we don't want to lose the history. We don't want to lose part of who we are, because that's how we've become who we are, and we want others to remember, this is a part of our culture. This is a part of who we are. So I really applaud you for making that a mission, a life mission. Your boys are very blessed to have you as a father. You are full of wisdom and full of kindness. So you're raising that next generation just absolutely the way to make changes in the world, is the way that you're raising them. You're leading by example, which makes such a huge difference. So thank you. I appreciate you so much, and we'll definitely have to stay in contact and connected. So
for sure. Thank you for having me.
And again, guys, get a hold of him at Mnemonic 25. So I will say goodbye for now, but we will chat a little bit later. Thank you, everyone, for being on here. Really appreciate you. If you're watching this on the replay, please make sure you share this out. I mean, what a great message, and it was great strolling down memory lane with John. So I'm going to say goodbye for now. And until next time, go out there and live that American dream and help others to achieve it as well.